and we're going to start with one that actually, as Michael said earlier, was Audrey's brainchild. And it's really, you know, calling it Breaking Bad or how to be a better customer or how to make sure you're doing the right thing and you're not making everything worse is kind of what this is going to focus on. And so I'm going to bring up Mark Voytek, who is IAOP's thought leader and also founder of Voytek Technologies, to be our moderator. And then I will ask you to bring up your panel.
Thank you. So we've got about 45 minutes that we'll spend time together, but I wanted to bring up the panel first. We've got some folks from Vee Technology, Vee Healthtek actually, Mohini, who's a senior manager, Vee Healthtek offshore delivery, Divya, who is client ops director, also with Vee Healthtek, and Mike Nacarato. He's more on the buy side. He's a fantastic golfer. I think we won the first IAOP scramble with like a 58, but it was real. It was a Cigna exec and a Wells Fargo exec. So some good friends and family here. Name of it, Breaking Bad Outsourcing Relationships. You know, we're going to talk about why outsourcing relationships go sideways. And one of the things that I've done, I've been a sourcing advisor for 25 years, started at TPI, ended up at Ernst & Young running outsourcing advisory for them. And when you get into an outsourcing contract, what I typically say is, you know, you're going to have a problem. And 2 years in, you're not going to like the supplier and the supplier's not going to like you. But it's marriage. And so, but it's not marriage where you can just get divorced. You can't walk back 100, 1,000, 2,000 FTEs. And so you have to live with it. So we'll talk a little bit about that. One of the things, and this is Audrey, so I'm filling in for Audrey, but the reality is that none of these characters, who saw Breaking Bad? First, show of hands. So kind of, wow, a lot more people than I thought. None of these characters started out as bad, right? Breaking Bad was not about the chemistry or the crime. It became addicting because it was about smart people under pressure make small decisions that slowly look and just go in the wrong direction. And that's the setup for today. So again, we've introduced the panelists. There's about a few key facts that I'll do for alignment on this one. Multiple studies, 5 key themes. There's misaligned expectations. Communication and governance issues follow. I would say, you know, you need to have respect, trust, and communication in any relationship, and outsourcing relationships are just that way. So it really boils down to those 3 things. There's quite a bit of cultural friction, and then the factors that erode trust, they show up not always in big ways, as we talked about with Breaking Bad. There were these small things that occur over time that 2 years into that outsourcing relationship, things just aren't working out well. And then ultimately, roughly, and this is a statistic through some research, 1/3 of outsourcing programs fail to achieve their original business case due to value leakage and misalignment. And what I've said, and I've been on LinkedIn talking about this, and Jim Lee and Mike and others, you know, governance taking center stage. And so you got to be able to measure things not with emotion, but with metrics and with your relationship. And that's kind of what we'll talk about today. So we have 3 panelists. We've got 5, 6, 7, 8 questions, something like that. We'll go through those. We will accept questions from the audience, but really just wanted to jump into it. You guys ready? Mohini, right, from a service provider perspective, what's the fastest way trust breaks down between the delivery team and a client in an outsourcing relationship based off of your experience?
I would say the first one would be misaligned expectations, especially the expectations from the client side changes after the contract has been signed. We see that a lot, and I'm saving the best one to the last. And I can say the second one being the inconsistencies. That inconsistency can be, you know, the difference in the optimization of workflows, you know, again, the expectations and feedbacks from the client, especially I'm talking from the healthcare perspective, but it can apply to any industry we're talking about. So the feedbacks coming from the client needs to be consistent, because if it is not consistent, it creates ambiguity and confusion in the team members. This is one thing first I would sort it out. And also, I would like to quote a quotation here, the client silent trap. The silence creates anxiety in any room. Doesn't matter whether we are talking to the big people or whether we are in the industry, you need to break the silence. That means you have to communicate, communicate, and over-communicate. Over-communication never fails you, especially when you're in a relationship between a supplier and a buyer. And I'm saving the best to the last because last week, I'm going to quote an example here. I was in Chicago last year, and this is the first time me addressing an audience at this capacity. I have always been into business meetings, but it's going to be like one-on-one, or the maximum I would say 5 people. So I'm going to make my point very clear, but please bear with me. I'm kind of nervous as well. So I was in Chicago last week to meet a client in the last minute, and this client is the global industries healthcare provider in the EMR. So we went to meet this client to get the business. So she was asking me questions, I was telling her questions, I was telling her answers, and I lead CDI operations globally for my organization. So we have 14 delivery centers, and she was asking me so many questions, and she was asking the points where she wants to get the confidence to buy the business. I told her everything. We hire physicians, we hire registered RNs, we have delivery operations in Philippines, we have US RNs, and we provide certifications, we give them CEUs. She was happy with all of them, but she was like, no, you're missing something. There is something you're not telling me. And then I told her we have approval from industry leads that we provide work from home to the team, which we are the only company we provide work from home to the CDI laterals in India and Philippines too. Because thanks to Audrey, and we have received approvals from the clients as well. And she's not buying, she's not happy. She was like, you are missing something. You are missing something. And then I told her, I didn't realize that it's that important, but then I was like, if I can say this, I don't like to work or manage my team under too much scrutiny or micromanagement. This is something which I don't do it in my teams, and this is what we expect from clients as well, to do the micromanagement. So, and I also want to close this statement by saying, not all the clients do it intentionally. They are in a fear of losing the control. So that could be the reason why clients want to do the things. They are doing it, but it feels like a macromanagement from the offshore perspective. Yeah, that's all from me.
Appreciate that. Those are some good updates. I think the ability for trust to erode in that outsourcing relationship, it does happen quickly, and the ability to try to get that back on track through communication and then respect is something that, when I look back on, when I was doing some third-party advisory, I created a governance health check, and it was to kind of uncover those things that, I called it marriage counseling. At EY, they told me I couldn't call it that. Now I'm not at EY anymore, so I can call it whatever I want, I guess. But the ability for then to have conversations and identify those 5 things that you need to do to get that relationship back on track, and trust being the most important is critically. Next question is to Divya. What do clients do, often without realizing it, that makes service providers feel they are not trusted?
Thank you, Mark. I'm just going to start with what Mark said in the beginning, right? Trust doesn't usually break with big failures. It kind of starts with the small signals. And some of those significant signals are, the first one I would say is micromanagement, when clients over-specify the how rather than explaining or over-specifying the why and what's, right? Sometimes they micromanage on how things are done rather than rely on the outcomes. And the second thing is what I call as shadow management. It's when clients go over the agreed communication hierarchy. They just go around it and reach out to different people in different hierarchies, which does not provide them accurate answers, but it kind of signals them distress when they don't receive accurate answer. And the third one is what I call as over-validating the work that is being done. So when I say over-validating, yes, checks or audits that are being done by the clients is absolutely fine, because as an offshore vendor, I would like to take feedback, I would like to take any kind of comments that are coming in that can improve or better my best of what I'm doing, right? But when the validations are done at 100%, which is usually redundant as well, even from a client's cost perspective or resource management, it is redundant as well when they do 100% audit checks, but it also signals a lot of mistrust to an offshore vendor like us. So technically, trust, to summarize, it just erodes when the teams are monitored rather than being tasked and trusted with the outcomes. and it erodes when they are getting over managed by the clients themselves. And the way we can build it faster is by communicating or by kind of explaining or setting the context on the required outcomes, clearly defining the outcomes, and let the offshore vendor kind of take care of how they get there. They have to basically own it. They have to be trusted to own it and kept accountable to own it, and rather than just being signaled with kind of all this micromanagement and stuff.
One of the things that when we coach clients and they go on this outsourcing journey, especially Gen 1, you're contracting what versus how. You don't want to tell them how to do it, but you want to contract what gets done. And there were a couple of key words here, whether it's FTE based, which really is kind of going away completely, transactional based and outcome based. But I think as we move to outcome, if you continue to micromanage and if you continue to want to know how the stuff works, or overly micromanage, to use some of the words that the panelists have already talked about, I think that's where this relationship between the service provider and the client starts to erode pretty quickly. So you're contracting for what, not how. It's important for you to know how, but not get overly involved in that. That's what the contract's for. That's what SLAs are for, continuous improvement, dialogue, the governance structure. We were joking earlier about the governance exhibit, 20, 25 years ago. That exhibit didn't even exist. It would be exhibit 13 or whatever the number was, and it would be completely blank and to be determined 90 days into the outsourced contract. And 91 days or 2 years later, you look at that governance exhibit and it still wasn't filled out. So when I jokingly say governance takes center stage, I get real passionate about this stuff, but also it's less about how and more about what, especially with outcome based. Michael, from the client side, what causes you to lose trust in this supplier, and how quickly does that happen?
It can happen very quickly, obviously, but I do want to say my perspective is from the second line of defense. So from the buy side, we're not the group that actually decides and outsources processes. We are a second line of defense, and we do vendor risk management. So we're in a unique situation where we have to call balls and strikes between our internal colleagues, and the vendors. And there's multiple opportunities for trust to break down. And I think the very first step is when there's a disconnect between the sales team, and I think that's what you were alluding to, Madani, and our internal business partners. They get oversold. They get oversold on what they can do, how they can do, how fast they can do it, at what level of quality. And what happens in that situation, which I think is catastrophic, is a month, 2 months into the relationship, then the contract comes out of the drawer. That's the worst possible thing that can happen. So that's in the beginning when the relationship can go south. When the vendor says yes to everything, and they're not honest and they don't push back and say, hey, that's not really in our bailiwick. You may want to go somewhere else for that.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because one of the phrases that I often used is change orders, right? The client thinks that everything's included in the contract, and in many cases, or in some cases, some service providers, I'm not calling out anyone in the room, the ability for them to think everything's a change order on their side where they can kind of make money. I think that's an area that sometimes doesn't get scrutinized because the geographies and the business units don't know what's in the contract, and so they sign those change orders, and it takes a really good governance team to be able to identify when those change orders made sense or not. It's hard for audit to go back in time and try to correct those. But Mike, maybe talk a little bit about that, change orders.
Yeah, change orders again. Now instead of innovating and driving your business forward, now you're into paper. And now is where it gets contentious, right? Because the margins are usually slim as it is. And again, it takes away from the exact reason why you outsourced and why you created that strategic partnership. And it just creates ill will, and everybody's on their heels, and it just totally derails your main goal and objectives.
I talked about it earlier. It gets emotional. And so again, fight fire with facts. And so having a good governance structure, oftentimes when we walk into clients and they want to transition from either their current state of, nothing is outsourced, or maybe they have a couple of outsourced relationships, but again, they want to transition and transform. Before they jump into a new effort, around GBS, we'll call it GBS, having a good foundation in governance, again, so you've got the metrics for what things cost, where the work's done, the SLAs, the KPIs, the potential for the volumes, who's delivering what where. All of that is important if you're going to transition because, again, the business units and geographies have relationships with their people that are doing the work or the service provider that has delivered for them. And again, the ability to kind of, again, have a dialogue about, no, things have gotten better, 25% here, 50% improvement there. But if you do it on emotion, that's when I see these relationships, that respect, trust, and communication just completely breaks down. Or the governance meetings that are weekly, monthly, quarterly, they become firefighting sessions, task-based and operational fixes versus what really needs to happen in the pyramid structure of governance that I know James and Mike, you'll be talking about that on Thursday. So any other thoughts on this question?
Yeah, exactly what you just said there. If you don't create that open, honest environment, issues just manifest. And if you don't feel safe as the buyer or the provider, bringing them on the table, that it's going to be a collaborative solution, there's not going to be finger pointing. Again, you have to look at it as there has to be two winners. There can't be a winner and a loser. So just creating that environment where it's just open, honest communication. It's a strategic partnership. We're both aligned for the same goals. That's critical in maintaining trust.
And he said, I sometimes use the word capital P partnership versus small p. I know, there's some emotion. We'll probably have this at the end with some questions, but, the ability to say it's a partner. Well, are they a partner or aren't they? I would say from an outsourcing relationship, especially the role of technology and the business value, speed, risk, and value that needs to be considered in any GBS, whether it's an outsourcing relationship or a setup of captives, but have those things at a defined state is critically important. So. Divya, question to you. What is one common misunderstanding U.S. clients have about offshore teams that causes the most friction in practice?
Okay, so if I had to call out one, that is, kind of thinking all offshore teams are, interchangeable. Let's say I might have multiple delivery centers across different regions. So there is a common misunderstanding when it says that when it's an offshore vendor, the teams are interchangeable. So there is a good gap between the culture, communication, and professional norms of a team that is working out of Chennai, India, versus the team that can work out of Manila, Philippines. There is always going to be a different culture, different communication, and different professional norms. And that is one thing that is often misunderstood, that these teams can be interchanged, their capabilities can match each other, and we can probably move around resources between these two regions. So that, if you want me to call out one, that would be the major misunderstanding, I would say, culturally.
Mohini, what do offshore teams misread about U.S. client expectations, and what happens as a result?
I would like to quote a few here. The significant one would be the difference between completing a task and owning the task. Most of the times, it was assumed that completing the task is important, but I would say owning the task and knowing the outcome is very important. Owning the outcome is very, very important after completing the task. Coming to the delivery culture or offshore culture or US delivery culture, I'm including my own in it as well. We are trying to be the excellent executors. We follow the process set by the client. We meet the metrics, we escalate the problems when we see a problem, and then we close the ticket. For all of us, it looks like a high performance. Our numbers are met, SLAs are met, our numbers are green. But this is not what clients are looking for. Clients are not buying the task completion. They are buying the confidence. They're buying the peace of mind that somebody on the other side of your time zone is taking care of your business as if it is their own business. And also, creating an urgency. I would say it's cultural to the core. When client says, can you complete it as soon as possible? On the offshore perspective, we think it as we have some more time to do it. But we need to understand the tone of the client. That is very important. And the other thing would be underestimating how relationship matters to the clients. I always tell my teams to maintain the communication effectively, regularly. And clients should think us as an extension of or they should think us as their colleagues or extension of their workers or their staff. They shouldn't think us as a vendors. The moment they start treating us as a vendors, that's the time they are going to replace you with the next vendor. So that is very important. And also, I can think that most of you can relate to this one. Offshore people consider feedback as criticism than it is an investment. So this is something from the offshore perspective. Myself and my team, we always think it as a constructive criticism and the feedback as constructive one, and we make sure it's an educational point for both the client side and also for the offshore team. So this is where I like to build my team, taking the feedback in a positive way, constructive way, rather than it is a criticism, because this is where the investment of trust begins between the client and the vendor.
Thank you. Michael, cultural assumptions. What cultural assumptions do suppliers most commonly overlook from a client perspective?
Just building on what you said there, the communication has to be constant. I often find that the supplier relies on the QBR as the relationship and the relationship building, and then between QBRs, they tend to go silent, which then leaves our internal stakeholders to fill the narratives themselves. So keeping constant communication, relationship building, you can't build trust 4 times a year.
Yeah, I think the QBRs, the attendance of the governance meeting, the key to the minutes, the following up on the tasks, activities, and deliverables of those meetings. If I think about that governance health check, when I walked into clients and we asked them for the meeting minutes from the QBR, and they didn't have one in 6 months, or the notes weren't clear, or it just became kind of a session where everybody was complaining about each other, those aren't good situations to be in. And so, again, I think part of the balance between the communication, the documentation, the dialogue, transparency. I know Audrey and we were in DC a couple of years ago for a smaller version of this, and that was a key topic, right? The transparency associated to kind of make sure that then feeds into the trust so that you can have that dialogue. And if you have a problem, then let's get it stated. And so one of the reasons why we create those pyramids for that governance structure that I alluded to earlier, you want to have that executive sponsor who helped you make the decision for the outsourcing involved. And so if then something needs to occur, both sides, because they both have that executive sponsor, the supplier has one, the client has one, that's when that dialogue needs to occur. And we were talking to a client actually this morning about some sessions that you do even before the outsourcing decision's made. Before you select the supplier, you want to have those executive sponsors meet. And it's not always, the suppliers are always willing to meet with the client. The clients are not always willing to meet with the suppliers, or that exec sponsor becomes a steerco where no one has the ability to make a decision. And so I think that's also pretty critical, the ability for someone to be accountable for the decision. And it's not just pre-selection, pre-contract, but post-contract during those QBRs that Mike was alluding to. Mike, some further comments?
Yeah, I was going to say, we help our internal colleagues understand the difference between monthly scorecards and monthly reviews and the quarterly business review. The quarterly business review has to be more strategic in relationship building and problem solving. Metrics and SLAs, they're addressed on a monthly basis. So taking a lot of time out of a QBR to talk about an SLA that was missed 90 days ago is not fruitful for anyone.
Let me do a pause for some questions from the audience. We've got kind of a third section that we're going to go into, but I really want to just, if there's a couple of questions. I know we've thrown a lot at you. It's probably stuff you've heard. Maybe we've dumbed it down too much. Maybe we confused you. But if there's questions on any of that, happy to take a couple of questions. Maura.
I wanted to ask you if you could please define more specifically the difference between completing a task and owning a task. It definitely resonates with me with working with one of my supplier relationships, but the owning part of it, like, what does that mean in your perspective?
The question was completing a task versus owning a task, and what does that really mean? Thank you. Go ahead.
So most of the times offshore people think that, okay, we have completed the task, that's it. Our task or work has been speaking for ourselves to the client, but that's not it. What are the outcomes that come from the completion of the task, whether it is a positive or negative, you should have the courage to accept. And I always believe in bad news travels fast. So before the client knows it, it's always good When you identify it, you tell the client first. When you identify it at the first hand and tell the client, it's going to be a collaborative approach for both of you to solve the problem. But when you keep the problem or the bad news for the longer period of time until the client realizes that there is a problem, then that's the breaking of trust. I hope I answered your question.
If I may just add to that very quickly, right? When completion of task can just mean numbers, I just completed 100 tasks. But when owning the task means how much of the task have I resolved? Out of the 100, did I resolve 90 or did I resolve all 100? Is it just a check in the box activity, that is task completion? And when I say resolved, have I really resolved the problem? That I would call as, owning the task.
Good. Alice, is there a question?
I have two actually, and a build on the initial question for Mohini. What do you do with your teams to create that task ownership? What are some of those best practices?
So I'm talking from the clinical perspective. We are from the clinical documentation improvement. So when it comes to, I'm going to quote an example here. Suppose when we're reviewing a patient chart, we follow the guidelines, set coding guidelines, and we follow the industry standard CDA guidelines. But perspective changes for every patient to every patient. Perspective changes for every reviewer to every reviewer. But at the end of the day, when you see the chart, you see something different in the patient based on the clinical indicators. When I see the chart, I see something different. But at the end of the day, the outcome you are going to give on that patient should be standardized, should align with the coding standards, coding industry standards, the client standards, client internal standards, because client always need to have the coding standards, and they also have the internal policies set to follow certain reviews or certain accounts. So we have to make sure, as a team, I make sure that you discuss. When you see the different perspective, you have to make sure that your perspective is the best one for the patient. Your perspective is aligning with our internal standards, client internal standards, industry internal standards. So our outcome should be compliant. Yeah.
Thank you. My next question is actually for Michael. Have you had a situation where that trust was eroded with a partner, and how did you restore it?
Yeah, I would say the most common instance when that's eroded is when the supplier is not upfront with a problem or a solution. And we see that there's a slight degradation in SLAs, and you might think it's just production, speed of execution, but they're actually trying to work through an issue that if they brought it to the table and then we worked on it together, it could be resolved. So it's just not being transparent with why the SLAs aren't being met, and again, just getting people around the table. No good problem gets better with time. So the quicker you can address that and fix it, you can move on and rebuild the trust.
It's funny because I think, and I'm not one that normally overly documents things, but I was part of a project where the client was a CPG company out of Chicago here. And their concern, so after I set up the governance structure, I had an internal audit reach out to me, and they said, hey, we want to kind of review these conversations and the delivery of what we signed up for with these two specific vendors, one for R2R and one for order to cash. And we had to explain to the people that we were in essence auditing that, look, we want to obviously understand where we are in the journey, but we're trying to fix it. And so let's also communicate verbally, but let's also then have documentation. So let's close the loop. When I was at EY, we used to have, at the end of a project, we had working papers. We had to finalize our working papers. Everything was very formal. It's a good practice to get into. Is it overly litigious? Probably. Is it overly auditish? Yep. Did it cover us when we had a problem? Absolutely. It also helped us then be able to identify those and then have a system of record for kind of what occurred in the past, so we knew not to make that mistake again. So, just some other practical things that I think seen in practice. Don't be afraid to document. Don't do it just because you're trying to catch them. Mike alluded to kind of, if you're pulling out the contract in the first 30 days, 90 days of an outsourced relationship, that's bad. Typically it's bad, but you also want to have that documentation later on. I've had situations where everyone that made the decision, everyone that did the transition was off the project a year later. No one even knew where the contract was. This is back before we at least have some new technologies. It's back in the 2000s, but there's still stuff like that happening today. Thoughts on that, anyone? Panel?
Yeah, no, I would say another example of that is, you know, you have a contract, you write the requirements, and you get into the build, and you're asking the supplier to now do things that, you know, weren't scoped, weren't planned for, and just expecting, you know, them to do it. So it's on the onus of us as the buyers, the client, to make sure it's well documented, but knowing that we can't just ask our providers to take on added expense and cut into the time and delays because we didn't have requirements right up front.
And then the onus as well, this is why it's transparency and trust, that the supplier should at some point push back and say, you know, it's generally out of scope, you know, I'll do it for you this time, maybe, I'll do it for you this time, but it's kind of the last time, and truly have it be that last time. I think that snowball effect definitely occurs in outsourcing relationships. Another question?
So my question is really around misalignment, and I'd love to hear about the response from both the buy side and the sell side. It can come up in really two situations I'm thinking about. So Mark mentioned that today in outsourcing, it's more about transactional pricing versus FTE pricing. So the first example is, okay, the CFO signed off on transactional pricing, but then once you get to actually work with the business that is utilizing the services, they have more of an FTE mindset. And so how do you come to an alignment there? The other example I was thinking of that's similar situation is really around you have a well-trained staff workforce. They're highly trained, highly specialized. It takes time to get them to that point, and then you have a customer that thinks of you more as a capacity and wants to be able to go up and down. And so how do you deal with that situation where you've just spent all these resources on getting the staff, trained and ready to go, and then the customer's like, well, we're going to use you at this level for this month, and then the next month we want to be able to scale down if we need to.
I'm going to take your second question. So we always have a bench.
Kind of repeat the question, just so the audience can hear, because I don't know if they heard that. Just generally the question.
How do you manage having FTEs, suppose in case if we have FTEs?
Right, so the
we're
question is
talking
kind of
about attrition.
add FTEs with transactional volume, right? People can really relate to FTEs, because that's kind of the world that we've been in for a while. As it's transitioned to transactional pricing, at some point they're like, oh, okay, how many more FTEs are you going to add? And again, it's not really about that, because that's not what the contract says, but if you pull it out too early. But Mohini, go ahead.
I'm going to take the next question. You're talking about the attrition, right? You're addressing the attrition, like how are you going to manage deploying the people to the process? How are you going to train them? That was your second question, right? So we address that, we keep the bench always. We keep the bench for all the laterals we have in our organization. And we also have the freshers. We train the freshers for every lateral. Suppose, let me talk about my service line, CDI. We do have a bench of 10 CDIs sitting in India and 15 CDIs sitting in Philippines, including a leader. And every time, we won't keep the clients waiting that we need 6 weeks or 8 weeks of time to start the process, because we already have people on bench. And second thing is, in order to manage the cost from my side as well, we start training the freshers. I'm not talking about the CDI, but for the other laterals, we start training the freshers, and that's how we keep maintaining the people around, so that we don't keep the clients waiting for a longer period of time until we hire them, train them, deploy them, make them understand the client requirements. Yeah.
So to touch upon your first question, right, like we are moving into transactional role, but the offshore vendor is still thinking from a FTE mindset, right? That's again, when you talk FTEs, it's more like KPI metrics. Your SLAs are mostly going to be KPI metrics like production or quality, those kind of metrics. But when it comes to transaction, we basically have to work for an outcome-based, outcome-based efforts. That's what I call it as. So that's the difference that we create when we move from an FTE to transaction. We train our teams, we train our leadership to basically work and own that transaction, the entire transaction, and not just run behind KPIs. KPIs are important, obviously, but more than KPIs, the outcomes, when I say outcomes, it could be other metrics that is important for the client. So we just train our teams and leadership to ensure that they kind of own it as a transaction. They kind of act as an extended team, and they basically work for the outcomes and not just to satisfy the KPI metrics. And also to touch upon your second question, I think that was also about ramping down, if I understood it right. It's about like the client gives you one volume, and after you kind of stuffed up and everything, they just throw in to say that I have decreased volumes. Like I don't need 100 people, I probably need just 20 people. Or that can translate into transaction as well. I might have staffed up for 100 people, but your volumes can suffice only to 20 people. There are two ways. One is contractually, we can handle it by adding minimums to it. Your monthly contract basically reads to say that, I have to bill a minimum of 50 FTEs or 60 FTEs, and the vendor kind of keeps up with that many FTEs so that they are able to manage the volumes, as well as they are not getting hit on their, margins as well. They cannot staff up 100 people and just get paid for 20, right? So it would be better if we maintain a minimum value in the contract. That would basically save both the client as well as the vendor.
We had additional comments, Akash?
Yeah,
Or
so
question?
I have a question which is more about thriving together with the outsourced partners. So how do you drive innovation at an outsourced partner, or how do you incentivize them to bring innovation to the table?
That fits perfectly with the theme of the session, right? How can buyers be better buyers? You get what you pay for, right? You have to make sure that you're negotiating in good faith, that this is a strategic partnership, and you know that you're just not there to get SLAs and KPIs. You're about the growth of your business and adding innovation. I think last year I was here, we coach our internal colleagues that you get what you pay for. And I think it ties into the last question a little bit too. When our colleagues want to go and negotiate the lowest margin, the lowest price point, they then come back to us and say, well, attrition is high or the quality's not there. And they'll say, hey, we're just not getting A talent. And then we have to remind them, well, you paid for C talent. You didn't pay for A talent. So that, again, we're in a unique situation where we can call balls and strikes internally, but you have to have a win-win contracting if that's what's there. And then the other thing, if I could just tie it back to your question around the peaks and valleys of volume. Most of us buyers, we know if our work is seasonal. We know there's going to be peaks and valleys, and we need to bring that to the table up front. Like, again, 5-6 months in, like, oh yeah, we're dropping 15 FTE. It's not on our providers to solve that, especially if we knew we had this cyclical volume path.
Question?
Yes, going back to criticism versus feedback, what method have you found to be effective from a vendor governance perspective with shifting a vendor from a posture of defensiveness to one of accountability and focus on problem solving?
My answer is very, very simple. Stop pointing and saying you didn't do this. It's we. Every sentence should have we in it. How do we solve this? How did this happen? What can we do together? When there's finger pointing, and again, I hate to say it, but going back to the contract, hey, you said you would do this, you broke it, you fix it kind of thing. A true strategic partnership means everybody's at the table for everything, the good and the bad. And I think that fear is inherent by the provider, by the way the buyer responds to these things early, right? They set the stage if they're there to blame somebody or they're really there to work together. So it goes back to knowing the culture you're operating in, knowing whether it's a very hierarchical culture and folks will keep a problem and try to solve a problem before they have to escalate it. You have to know the culture in which you're operating in. You have to give them a path to feel comfortable talking about it earlier and not be punitive.
Jim?
Great perspectives there. An early vision of office hours. Can't wait to hear some of the things on Thursday because these are the kind of questions that pop out. I'd remind you that while all partners are vendors, not all vendors are partners. And you need to intentionally decide how you're going to manage your vendors in your portfolio, the ones that are truly strategic partners. So that said, with the title Breaking Bad, that kind of assumes that you're already underway and you're trying to fix problems. This reinforces the great examples and everything, the importance to being intentional in establishing good governance from the get-go. And the same themes that you keep reiterating, culture, communications, and one other buzzword that hasn't been mentioned, organizational change management. Where is the client relative to this outsourcing? Are they a first generation? We've never done that. Do they even understand the operating model that they've signed up for? Did I sign up for a managed capacity of people, FTEs? Did I sign up for managed services or some other thing? And what business outcomes apply to that? So, to the panel, how do you ensure when you start seeing signs of maybe we didn't do a great job during transition of preparing for this? How do you bring that forward and start having those kinds of discussions, both from the supplier side as well as the buyer side?
Yeah, I think it's setting up and starting that reset, right? Again, we're in this together. This is what we thought was going to happen. It didn't happen. Now, how do we course correct?
So this is always my favorite part, not because it's the end. We're going to ask each panelist to just finish the sentence. Outsourcing relationships thrive when?
There is an honesty.
Louder.
When there is an honesty and we speak the same language, and obviously that builds the trust, and that is where we thrive on.
I guess I would add to that, when the client, who's the geography of the business unit in my example, doesn't necessarily is able to differentiate between Vee Healthtek in this case and themselves, because they are a true partner. They're not just a vendor. So just for some clarification. Divya? Let me do it again. I'll say it again. Outsourcing relationships thrive when?
Okay, so that's when the vendor sees the client's loss as their own loss, and they see the client's win as their own win. And similarly, the client sees the vendor as their extended team and not just as a resource pooling center.
Michael, outsourcing relationships thrive when?
I would say the same thing, when it's a win-win situation and everybody is working towards the common goals, and that you as a buyer remember you didn't outsource the risk or the accountability. You still own that, and it's a partnership to drive to your desired business outcomes.
And just to summarize, and I appreciate this, I mean, when we do the outsourcing advisory at the front end, and there's that full life cycle of the sourcing strategy, the implementation, whether it's outsourcing advisory or shared services and governance, it's really about speed, risk, and value. And if it's just lowest cost, go buy pencils, go buy paper. These aren't pencils and paper. They can be, but if it gets set up that way, we'll have the problems that we talk about. So one last quick question from Ashish.
So it's not a question. I'm just taking advantage of the fact that
Okay. Did you have the mic? I was wondering if you were going to say something, Ashish.
It's just an observation, right? Because we touched on communications, and I'm going to oversimplify this. But just hear me out. In the Western cultures, when you're communicating, the responsibility to get it communicated is upon the listener, right? I'm going to say something, and if you didn't get it, you're going to ask me the question, and you're going to follow up, and you're going to make sure you got what I'm trying to tell you. In the Eastern cultures, and again, as I want to acknowledge, I'm oversimplifying this, in that art of communication, the responsibility to communicate is actually on the speaker. So they end their sentences with, do you know what I mean? Did you get what I said? And so you can imagine how much of a dissonance that creates between two entities trying to communicate with each other in very simple form, but one expecting that the other side has received my message, and yet in the exact opposite stance, if I'm the American, I'm like, I got it the first time. Why the hell do you have to keep repeating everything you're saying, right? So it creates that, and so that goes back to, if we document everything, it's so important, even in team meetings, just to simply have a clear understanding of what was said, what was understood, and it's documented, much like you would do for your SOPs and things like that. And that was just there was no question in there.
One other question? No. All good. Appreciate everyone's time. Thank you, and I will see you in a couple more panels. Look forward to it.